Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick.
Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. 2020 has been a tough, tragic year. COVID-19 has turned our lives upside down. I'll talk about the myriad effects of this pandemic with my guest, Greg Kaufmann, an expert on poverty, a contributing writer to The Nation magazine, and the founder of talkpoverty.org. Greg, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Great to see you, Bob. I'm looking forward to being able to do this in person someday.
Yeah, I hope it's before too long. So We're living through a situation so bizarre now. I mean, we could hardly have imagined it at the beginning of 2020. And what I'd like to know from you are what are some aspects of this weird time that we're going through that seem the most surprising for you, the most difficult for you to process?
I can't believe that the current man in the White House still has a chance to win. I can't believe that I can believe it, but it's hard to get your head around that he leads among white voters.
I was going to mention that. I know it's really, I mean, maybe it's not shocking, but somehow it is still somewhat shocking to me.
Yeah, and I think the third thing I'd say is the way we keep talking now in a good way about the disparities that have been revealed about the pandemic, it remains to be seen whether we really respond from a public policy perspective.
Right.
And I guess I'm hoping to be surprised that we do respond from a policy perspective because, as you know, history says we probably wouldn't.
I know, and of course I have the same hope, but of course, you know, we're taping a few weeks before the election, and we're still waiting for Congress to respond with another support program for the folks who are out of work and still struggling with this pandemic. And as of this taping, that has not happened yet.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess that actually would be another thing that somewhat surprises me is you'll still hear people say, well, there's really no difference between the parties. And if you look at this pandemic response, as you said, we're still hoping that people can continue to get unemployment, which they will not be able to do with Republicans. They won't get that extension. They won't get the $600 increase.
Right.
We need localities to get money so that they can continue to employ people and respond to the pandemic. And they're holding that relief up. So,
and not to mention the additional costs to state and local governments of dealing with the pandemic itself, in addition to the support that they have to give to their employees.
That's right.
You know, I mentioned that Congress has not come up with this program, but I should make it clear that, you know, as you alluded to it, it's the Republican Party that's the stumbling block here. The Democrats have proposed a program that would extend the $600 additional unemployment benefits to jobless workers, but also would provide significant support to state and local governments and that sort of thing. And the Republicans just don't want to do that. So up until this point, at least, it's been a stalemate. Now, you live just outside of Washington, and you and your wife have 3 young children. Talk a little bit about the way or ways in which your lives have been significantly changed or perhaps even upended by this crisis.
Yeah, so we have a 13, 10, and 7-year-old, and my wife is a 4th grade teacher. And the spring was pretty difficult for us. I'm sorry, a 14-year-old, not 13-year-old. One of the things that's going is my short-term memory. But
Please don't talk about that. That's not one of my questions. And it's not something that I want to explore on this program.
It probably wouldn't make for a good interview. So, in the spring, the 14 and 10-year-old do pretty well online in terms of being fairly self-sufficient. 7-year-old needs a fair amount of support. And teaching is just hell right now for
I can't even imagine it.
Yeah. So my wife would be up till 2 a.m. every morning preparing and teaching during the day. I was able to work about maybe half time doing helping my 7-year-old with her stuff. And this year, my wife, we're in a position where she's able to take off work for a year. So this
Wow.
school year. Yeah. So I mean, our own lives really, if it needed to be driven home anymore, which I mean, hopefully in our case, we were pretty aware already, but like the privilege of being able to have somebody stay home from work to help with the kids. I'm able to work from home, all the things that this pandemic has brought out about privilege. And then compared to those who don't have it, working for low wages, risking illness, not having to choose between childcare and their work. I mean, you can see it all driven home right here in my household for sure.
On that point about the privilege that some folks have, or the fact that some folks are so much better positioned to cope with the crisis, I feel the same way about my wife and I. She runs a college scholarship foundation, the Posse Foundation, and she's been able to hold her staff together. And of course, they can work remotely. And, as a writer and a television host, I can work remotely. We live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So it's so much easier for us than, as you point out, for so many other people, which actually brings me sort of to my next question. You brought up the issue of the disparate impact. And, one of the things that we've noticed is that it's had an especially, a group that's been especially hard hit has been African Americans. And there's a variety of reasons why that's the case. And I'd like to just take a moment here and go over some of those. African Americans are more likely, and in many cases, much more likely to have chronic underlying conditions, which make them more susceptible to the more serious aspects of COVID-19. I'm talking about high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease. A fair number of people are obese, so all of those are danger signs. They're also more likely to be frontline workers. You mentioned that your wife is a teacher, but so many African Americans who work in the schools, who work for state and local government, who work in the healthcare industry, who work in food service, public transportation, so they can't work from home. So they're out there more exposed to the virus. And then, of course, African Americans are more likely to have substandard health coverage, if in fact they have coverage at all, which makes it more difficult for them to get the prompt response in terms of medical care that's so necessary. So I think it's important for us to really keep that in mind, and especially when we're talking about the kind of support that might come from the federal government and from state and local government. But we've been talking also briefly so far about the economic toll, Greg, and I'd like you to talk about that a little bit. A large portion of the population, even before this pandemic hit, were unable to respond to any kind of unforeseen emergency. I mean, if they had an expense of $300 or $400 or more, they just didn't have the money to cover it. And we're talking now about a large portion of the American population. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on individuals and families like that, and how they're coping or not coping?
Yeah. Well, you know, Bob, some of the work I'm doing right now is with an organization called southstrong.org. It's a
Mm-hmm.
coalition that was started by leader Stacey Abrams. It's 160 Southern organizations, scholars, and community groups. And they're looking at the pandemic response and public policy moving forward. And of course, the South has been hit disproportionately hard because there are large populations of communities of color, and particularly African Americans. Nearly half of all African Americans live in the South. In fact, if you include Texas, it's over half. So if you care about Black lives, you care about the South. And so when you say how are people coping, I immediately comes to mind the South for me, because they lack healthcare infrastructure. You know, 7 of the 12 states that haven't expanded Medicaid are in the South. They don't have a lot of communities, even a healthy grocery store in their community. They don't have infrastructure. They don't have access to public support programs. They don't have paid sick leave. I mean, you go on and on and on. I mean, you pick your economic indicator and it's lacking. And so how are people coping? I mean, that is exactly the question. How are people possibly coping? I mean, it really makes me think of, you know, I'm a huge fan, and you probably guessed I'd bring it up, your documentary, the title of which is Against All Odds. And I took that to mean you were focused on the Black middle class, and against all odds, there is a Black middle class.
Exactly.
All the systemic obstacles that have been placed before people. So when you ask how are people getting by, it's a miracle to me that they are. I will tell you that some of these Southern organizations I'm speaking with, and I'm doing kind of narrative change and media outreach work with them, you know, they've had to change their focus from advocating for good policy and working with communities and directly impacted people to advocate, to more direct service. Because how do you talk to somebody about, you know, getting involved in advocating for a grocery store in their neighborhood or a sewer system when they're just trying to get food on the table, or they're told they have to come back to work, but they don't have access to childcare? I mean, it really astounds me. And I want to connect it to what we were talking about before about privilege, because it astounds me that the people who are in a position of privilege, like you and I, and we still have a lot of stress in our lives during this.
Of course, this has not been easy for anyone in this country.
Not easy for anyone, but it is multiplied 4, 5, 6, 10-fold for people without resources and communities of color in the South and all over this country. And so the fact that people can't get that, I mean, still, that's another thing that's surprising to me and pretty friggin' outrageous, honestly. I don't know.
Right. And I really do think, I mean, this thing is such a long way from over, and there's always a danger, especially if there's not more assistance coming from the federal government, there's a danger that it's going to get worse. I mean, I think it's already worse than what we saw in the Great Recession back in 2008, 2009. But for example, we have not yet seen the wave of evictions and foreclosures that I anticipate. There's been some moratoriums that have been in effect. Some have run out. Others I would expect to run out before long. And people are just not going to be able to pay their rent. They're not going to be able to pay the mortgage. We've seen some coverage of long lines at food banks in different parts of the country. We see the dismal jobless numbers, and many of those jobs are not coming back. I'm not sure how many people are have accepted that fact. I still hear people talk about a V-shaped recovery. That's long gone. Right. So it's really an incredibly tough situation. And one of the things that I would like to ask you is, if you could wave a magic wand, for example, at this point, what are some of the things that you would like to see happen or enacted just to help ease the plight of these, let's say, poor and near poor Americans who are struggling so mightily?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you what immediately comes to mind. And again, this is something I'm working on with these Southern groups. Where is the money going right now that is meant to assist people? You mentioned rent, people who can't pay their rent. There was a really excellent, at least in theory, fund in the CARES Act called the Coronavirus Relief Fund, $150
Right.
billion to go to the states that they could pass on to local governments to help respond to the pandemic. So Bob, say you mentioned rent. If you're a community, you could start a rental assistance program for the first time.
Right.
You could give that money directly to food banks. All kinds of things we could do. You could give it to childcare providers so they could get their facilities able to have children there. What's happening, at least in the South, I know of 4 states. This is through the work of Hope Policy Institute in Jackson, Mississippi. They're using what's called a reimbursement model. So you can only get the money from the state. The governor has complete discretion where these monies go. You only can get the money if you can spend the money first, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you already have money, if you're a wealthier community, you can spend the money and get reimbursed. But if you're a poorer community and disproportionately community of color, then you're not going to be able to spend the money to get the money. It's really insane. And I hope that was clear. It's a little in the weeds, but so if I could wave a magic wand, I would say when we have hundreds of billions of dollars, let's look at the communities that are most impacted first and help them with basic needs.
I mean, I think it's quite clear, and it's perverse. The folks who need the assistance most are the ones least likely to receive it. How does that make sense? In what universe does that make sense? You mentioned Donald Trump, and of course, he's always the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of this presidential election. We always hear about how important any particular election is. I have to tell you, this seems to me to be the most important election of our lifetime. You also mentioned earlier that you can't believe that this fellow still has an opportunity, a chance to win this election. One of the things, and of course this is primarily his fault, one of the things that we're noticing is this widespread fear that the seeds of chaos have already been sown, and people are wondering or are worried about whether this will even be a fair election. Whether we already know that some folks are at a disadvantage because of gerrymandering and because of voter suppression and that sort of thing, which was going on long before this election and long before Trump. So we have the voter suppression, but now we have all of these comments from Trump about the election is going to be rigged. We see service cutbacks in the Postal Service. We see attacks on mail-in voting, which is insane when we're in the middle of a pandemic. And Trump has even actually encouraged his voters on several occasions, he's done it, to vote twice, which is not just against the law, it's a felony. How worried are you about the prospects of a possible tainted election?
Yeah, I mean, I think very. I think, most likely scenario, it seems that this is going to end up in the courts. It's going to be Florida and multiple states. I mean, maybe not most likely, but that's my fear.
Right.
And obviously, Trump benefits from chaos and fear. And that's what he's running on. And I'm sure, it's going to take a while for the mail-in votes to get in. I'm sure he's going to claim victory as quickly as he can. How worried am I? I literally am sick to my stomach right when you ask the question. I mean,
right. And you mentioned near the top of the show that there are folks who still think that there's not much difference between the two parties. And
Yeah.
I've been encountering people who have flat out said that they're not going to vote, either because they think that their vote doesn't mean anything, or that it won't be properly counted, or, as you mentioned, that they think that situation will be just as bad under Democrats as under Republicans. When you encounter that sort of thing, and you've been working with Stacey Abrams, who is a big time proponent of voting rights and getting people to the polls. What's your response? I mean, how do you respond to folks who make those kinds of comments or hold those kinds of feelings?
Yeah, and I should be clear, my work with Leader Abrams doesn't involve the voting rights work, but I will tell you when I do encounter it. So if I encounter it in sort of younger, progressive people, usually white, you know, I try to tell them, have the kind of conversation we just had about what are the stark differences between what the parties are doing. I get how both parties are too beholden to corporate interests. I get that. But, you know, but you have to draw these stark differences. Now, there's another side that I'm a little more sympathetic to. Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign and Reverend Liz Theo Harris, they're doing a ton of work to try to register lower income voters. And, you know, what they hear, and what's the same thing that both you and I heard as poverty reporters for years, sometimes they'll encounter people who are saying, look, nobody's speaking to the issues in our communities.
Right.
Nobody cares about our issues. And they only come around if they come around during campaign season. And so, you know, they're sort of so disaffected. And I get that a little bit more than sort of, you know, the people in my circles who say that.
So do I. I understand that, and I've encountered that also. And of course, the response to that is to reach out to those folks. You know, they shouldn't be neglected in the way that they're being neglected, and those are votes that can be had.
That's right.
and they're votes available primarily to the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So to not reach out to those folks, you know, we've only got a few minutes left. I wanted to talk about race, because has emerged as such a big issue this year, and obviously it's an enormous focus of the presidential race, in part because of Trump's posturing, which has been disgusting, but also in part because of the police shootings and the protests that, to my great surprise, have lasted for a long time and have covered much of the country. As long as I've known you, I don't know where you grew up, but what I want to ask you is, given where we are now in this country, how have your views on race changed from when you were much younger, let's say when you were high school or college age, until now, given all the stuff that you've covered, all the stuff that you've seen, and all the stuff that's erupted this year? How has your view shifted?
That's a great question. And so you know, I grew up in DC and the DC suburbs. My dad was in DC, my mom was in the DC suburbs. And I could see in high school pretty early on, I mean, I grew up during the crack epidemic, and I could see the disparities between one DC and another DC. I remember reading early on about kid walking to school and getting shot. I mean, I knew how much better off our communities in wealthier DC were. And so that was clear to me. But the big change, even recently as a poverty reporter, you know, when I used to report on poverty, I would cover the disparities for sure. But I kind of felt like, you know, if we raise the minimum wage and we have better unions and we invest in housing and schools, it'll all be fine. It's not. It's not. We really have to pay attention, call out, face our history. I'm a big believer in a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because we've got to know our history and how racism permeates literally every aspect of American life. You can't name a sector where it's not had a huge impact. And
no question about it.
So I think that's the biggest change for me as a reporter. You can't just go to good policies that benefit everyone. You really have to look at how racism is affecting people and craft public policies that respond to those obstacles, take out those obstacles.
Those are such big issues. I'd love to have you back and actually talk about that. I mean, we can do a program on that. Greg, I want to thank you for being willing to sit for this interview today. It's been a terrific conversation. To our viewers, I want to say thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Bob.